Okay, so hello. Here we are, part 2. So I left you thinking about where psychological well-being and PERMA might fit in terms of subjectivity and objectivity, in terms of the definition and assessment. Okay, so perhaps you've written some notes in the Wellbeing Cafe, or maybe you've put some comments under the YouTube videos. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what you all say about that. So let's think now about some other ways in which well-being measures can vary. One is whether they are domain specific or about the whole life. So let's look at these examples. The most obvious ones is anything to do with life satisfaction or life as a whole. Okay, so the question, to what extent are you satisfied with your life? Or the questions that are on the satisfaction with life scale, which are down there. They are very much inviting you to think about your life as a whole, which is quite big, isn't it, when you think about it? And it doesn't kind of tell you what to think about, remember, because it's entirely subjective, but it also doesn't give you a time frame. It doesn't say right now or in general. So it's really kind of letting you think about your whole life, either right now, all of your life, all the different aspects of it, or even all of your life, back, all the way up to now, right? So, whole life measure, that is. But there is another way to do it, and that is to ask people about specific aspects of your life. So you might want to put me on pause for a minute and just make a quick list of the different ways you would chunk up your life in terms of the different kind of domains or chunks of your life. Again, I'll have a little bit of water while you put me on pause. Okay, maybe you've brought me back now. So, let's see how other people did it. So, Cummins, for example, decided that there were 7 important life domains: health, safety, emotional well-being, material well-being, productivity, community, and intimacy. And other researchers went on to say there were maybe 13 or 15 different domains. So, ideally, it should be a manageable number of chunks, and it should relate to what people actually think about when they think about their lives. So once you've decided what your domains are or your chunks are, you've got to then ask people about them separately, okay? And a few people have tried this. In other words, instead of those questions about think about your life as a whole, are you satisfied with your life, they ask things like, are you satisfied with the relationships in your life? Are you satisfied with your job and your work? All right. So basically, you can start to really chunk well-being up in terms of life aspects. But once you've done that, you've got a problem. Okay. How do you add those up to accurately reflect life? Let's say you just did it in 3 chunks: relationships, work, and other. And I've just randomly picked that out of my head. Do you add those up? Do you ask people about their relationships, their work, and other, and just add up the scores? Or do you weight them? Are some more important than others? And what some researchers realised is that some domains are more important to some people than others. It varies from person to person. So ideally, you also need to know not only how people are doing in each domain, but how they would rank them in terms of importance. That means then you can weight people's responses. In other words, if they think that relationships are the most important bit of their life, that gets given the most weight compared to something in their life that they feel is less important. In other words, you can then get a kind of accurate numerical indication of how someone's doing in their life domains, how important they are, and kind of multiply all that together. So there's been quite a lot of that in terms of research, and it has been shown that there is a clear relationship between domain and whole life satisfaction. In other words, if you measure them separately and then correlate them, look at them together, people who have high satisfaction in individual domains will also have high satisfaction in their whole life. That kind of makes sense, really, doesn't it? Okay, so another way that well-being measures can differ is whether they're kind of real-time or retrospective. In other words, are they now, or are they asking you to reflect and think back? So let's look at some of our measures that we've looked at already. So here we've got satisfaction with life. Again, have a think now about how you would answer these and what you would base your decision on. Look at the first 4 questions. In most ways, my life is close to my ideal. The conditions of my life are excellent. I'm satisfied with my life. So far, I've got the important things I want. Are they about now? Or are they? So some understandings of the cognitive judgments that people are making while they answer these questions suggest that people are making comparisons. They're either comparing themselves with other people, or they're comparing themselves with their own expectations, or they're comparing themselves with their own past. Okay, so in other words, these are about your whole life, but not necessarily right now. There should be some retrospection. And interestingly, the final question stands out in terms of reliability. In other words, quite often, if you take this question out, the whole scale becomes more reliable, because this particular question, if I could live my life over, I'd change almost nothing, really invites people to think about their past. In other words, people can answer the first 4 questions just thinking about right now, but the 5th one is very much about comparing themselves to the past. Okay, it really requires retrospection. So the point is that this measure is very much about one's whole life, all the different domains, and kind of about now and a little bit of the past. But it's kind of doing everything all at once and letting you think about whatever you want. Here's PANAS again. So the time frame for this, for asking people about to what extent they felt these positive and negative emotions, the time frame can be adjusted. In other words, you can ask about right now, the past week, the past month, the past year. So, how accurate do you think your assessment of how much you felt these emotions will be for each time frame? And how well do you think they fit together? In other words, if I asked you to answer these questions for the past year, how often you'd felt these emotions, do you think they would accurately predict how you're feeling right now? So you might be identifying the issue that I'm getting at with these kind of different time frames. Basically, there is an issue with retrospection. How accurate is our memory? Are we more likely to remember positive things than negative things, or negative things than positive things? Okay, that can be affected by our personality, our mood, the weather, things that have just happened to us. Okay, so basically our memory can be distorted, and it can be influenced by the context of when you're being asked to think about it. So, perhaps asking people to think about how often they felt an emotion in the past year, or in the past month, or even in the past week, might not be as accurate as we'd like it to be. So, how can we answer this issue? We can use something called the experience sampling method. Now, this used to be done with something called Pages or Palm computers, but of course it's been replaced now by smartphones and various different apps. What they do is they take a random sampling of moods and feelings over time. Okay, in other words, you can get an app, and there's loads and loads of apps out there, and you're welcome to go and have a hunt around and have a look for different happiness or well-being measurement apps. They will either ask you to decide when you want to record your feelings, or they will randomly ping you to ask you to record. And really the most accurate way to do it is the random sampling. So, an ideal way to do experience sampling method is to randomly take samples of someone's moods and feelings throughout a day and over quite a long periods of time. What that does is it then controls for contextual factors and temporary fluctuations in mood. In other words, what we're saying is your mood and feelings vary. We could ask you as researchers about your mood and feelings as a one-off, but that doesn't necessarily represent your whole well-being or your life. We could ask you to consider life as a whole, but again, we don't know how accurate a one-off measure is. So what we can do is ask you about your mood, your feelings or satisfaction at regular random times, and then aggregate it. In other words, take an overall average. Whilst you're doing that, we can also identify by asking, what are you doing right now? Who are you with? Okay, so you can also get extra information that adds into the context. So, you get a huge amount of data doing experience sampling method. It becomes a very complicated analysis. Okay, remember what you're getting is an aggregate of moods or feelings. You're not getting overall life satisfaction. You're getting an aggregate of asking about feelings over random bits of time. So one issue is that this can't work for all types of measures. In other words, I could have an app that just pings you 10 times a day, every day for like a month, and asks you how happy you are on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I could look at that individually and as an aggregate. Okay? But let's look at some of the psychological well-being measures. These kind of questions are not ones that suit being asked multiple times regularly. Things about your personality, things about purpose in life, these don't really suit the experience sampling method. Okay, so the experience sampling method is more about mood and feelings that are then added up to be a proxy for overall well-being, which is slightly different to some of these other measures like psychological well-being or PERMA that are trying to get at a kind of deeper well-being that's not just related to mood. So hopefully you can see how different measures fit in with different conceptualizations. Okay, so an alternative is day reconstruction. This is an example. You might be asked to construct a diary of the previous day with these instructions. Think of your day as a series of scenes or episodes. Give each episode a name to help you remember it. Write down the times, how long it lasted, indicate what happened, that kind of thing. So this is something called the day reconstruction method. And what this was trying to do was get away from experience sampling, in other words, the kind of random pinging and asking for moods, but address the issues of retrospection and problems with memory that we talked about earlier. So the day reconstruction method has structured questions about each section of your day, and then asks you about moods and feelings in those sections. So, again, this should deal with memory issues. It gives you really clear and direct instructions, helps you identify experiences and activities, and should therefore be less disruptive than experience sampling, okay, which asks at random times. But it does take a long time to do, so it is quite intrusive and does still rely on memory and retrospection. So, everything we've talked about so far, although they're different types of methods, these can be bunched together as self-report. Okay, any kind of questionnaire, whether it be one you fill in with pen and paper, or whether it be one that pings on your phone, or whether it be a kind of diary thing that you complete, or whether it be just about moods and feelings, all of that is you self-reporting. In other words, it's your judgment of your subjective experience. It should represent what you think and feel about your life, with little interference or interpretation by other people. Okay. However, they can be influenced by context, stuff that's happening at the moment. Have you just been upset with something? Have you just had a really good time? Maybe you are a very pessimistic or optimistic person, and that colours your view of your life. Maybe you're the kind of person who always ticks 7, always picks something from the end of a scale, or always goes for the middle of a scale. All of those issues can affect self-report measures. So maybe self-report measures on their own are not the ideal or gold standard way to measure well-being. So there are other ways to do it. We can get something called informant reports. In other words, if you're a participant, you might do self-report scales, and another person will also report on your well-being. It's often done with things like married couples, okay? In other words, you report on yourself, you self-report on your well-being, and someone who knows you very well also reports on your well-being. And they check if these reports correlate. It can often just be with one person, or it can be better with many people. And there has been shown to be very high correlation between self and informant reports. In other words, they add to the accuracy of well-being information. There's also something called expert ratings. Okay, one example of this is facial measures. Okay, so you can, if you're an expert, establish whether somebody is smiling genuinely or not because of how the cheek and the cheekbones and movement around the eyes are. So you could do, for example, observational studies or looking at photographs to establish whether you think people are, in a genuine good mood. Use that as a proxy for well-being. And there was quite a famous study a long time ago that looked at college yearbook photographs of women, and they did suggest that the women who had the more genuine smiles in their photographs had higher well-being later in life. So, yeah, expert ratings are a possibility in terms of maybe looking at videos or in terms of looking at photographs. Okay. Another objective way is physiology. Okay. Some studies have shown that your brain, to a certain extent, lights up in a particular way. Okay, that your brain will be activated if you're in a particularly good mood, that it will be respond to positive emotions in a particular way. So of course that suggests then that one way we could objectively measure well-being is to put people into a brain scanner. Okay, now that's going to be sort of quite expensive and quite time consuming, but what it means is that there is an objective way to view positive feelings in addition to self-report. Another thing is things like examining blood and saliva. Cortisol and other hormones are related to high well-being and being in a good mood. Okay, so there are other objective possibilities, although you should be very wary of reports that suggest that there are genes for happiness and genes for high well-being, because genetics is so complicated and there's so many genes kind of involved in things like hormone production and mood responses, that there's unlikely ever to be kind of one or two genes that just reflect whether you're a happy person or not. But there are potentially some objective physiological measures that can be used to measure well-being. There's also implicit measures. Now what these get at is the issue that when you use self-report, there's always a possibility that people aren't telling the truth, okay, and they're just telling you what you want to know. So one way to look at well-being without objectively saying, hello, I'm going to measure your well-being now, is to use implicit measures. So you can ask somebody to list their memories of good and bad events, and you might find it's likely that somebody in a good mood will create a longer list of good events and a shorter list of bad events. There's also things like word completion. If you give people an incomplete and ambiguous word, that people in a good mood will complete the words to create more positive words. There's also something where you can give people an array of faces, and they're a mixture of happy and sad, like little almost emoticon faces. And people in a happier mood or with higher well-being will find the happy faces faster than someone who's in a bad mood or with low well-being. Okay. And then there's also something called the implicit association tests. In other words, people tend to associate artificial words, in other words, fake words that you created. People in a happier mood will associate them with positive words, and people in a less happy mood or with low well-being will associate them with negative words. So there are potentially ways that you can implicitly, without somebody really knowing, measure someone's mood or well-being. So, this is the end of part 2. Time for a break, but you might want to think about whether you're interested in assessing your own well-being and what measures you could use and what measures you would use. You can think about what concepts mean something to you, the concepts that you discovered last week, or you might want to go and look on your phone and look at all the different apps that are available for measuring well-being, because there's loads out there. Okay, that's it for part 2. See you in part 3.